So, how did I get from there to here? Welcome back. Yesterday, I told you about the first part of my spiritual journey, how as a teenager I began to undertake this spiritual exploration, which eventually led me to become a Christian and to join the Christian church, and ultimately to go even further and become an Anglican priest. And I told you something about my theological development over that time. Well, I'd got to what seemed to be a reasonably comfortable place, but somehow my intellect was still not satisfied. Now, over time, I gradually began to understand more and more of the Christian teachings in a mythological sense rather than in a literal or historical sense. This included things such as, for example, the virgin birth and the resurrection of Christ. Now, I wasn't alone in that. It wasn't so radical as to put me outside the scope of the Anglican Church. There were plenty of Anglican theologians and clergy who were willing to interpret the virgin birth and the resurrection in mythological terms rather than literal historical terms. I also understood the fall in mythological terms rather than in literal and historical terms. But as I sought to understand that a bit more deeply, it became somewhat problematic. What the fall came to represent to me was a mythological expression of the break that takes place in the human psyche as the person develops between the me and the I. I've discussed that in a previous video. But it also referred to the emergence of consciousness, if you like, when human beings stepped out of this unconsciousness into a state of self awareness. And that too I understood as what the myth of the fall was describing. But when you look at that a bit more closely, it raises some serious questions. Because if the fall is, in fact, a mythological expression of this, the break in the human psyche and the rise into consciousness, then it can't be understood as a negative thing at all. It needs to be seen as a positive step forward. And there were already those, I wasn't alone in this, there were already those theologians who interpreted the fall as, in fact, a fall upwards. But if you see the fall as a fall upwards, then what happens to the concept of sin, the fall, and redemption? This no longer seems to apply. Now, this is really problematic because central to the whole Christian mythology was this concept of human beings being here, falling away from God, and needing to be redeemed to be taken back up to God again. If the fall's a fall up, that doesn't apply, or so it seemed to me. But the problems got worse than this. During the 1960s, there arose a radical theological movement known as the death of God theology. Now, this harked back to the 19th century writings of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote a book called Also sprach Zarathustra, or Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Zarathustra being another name for the Persian prophet Zoroaster. Now, in Nietzsche's telling of this story, Zarathustra goes up the mountain for a time of meditation, contemplation. And while he's up there, he receives a revelation. And he comes back down the mountain and he shares this revelation with the people. And what was it that was revealed to him? God is dead. And the corollary of this was, you are free. Now, the death of God theology of the 1960s took this idea and applied it to the life and death of Christ. It saw a new myth in the life and death of Christ. What it saw there was God taking upon himself a human life, withdrawing into a human life, and then allowing himself to die upon the cross and withdraw from the world. And in withdrawing from the world, he set human beings free. He set them free to realize their potential. Because there are certain elements in the mythology of Christianity which are very troubling. I'll mention just three of them. First is the concept of God as king or Lord. According to this mythology, God is the absolute ruler of all. What he says goes. We are his subjects. We are completely subject to God's will. Now, if your mythology of the way the divine relates to the human is one of an absolute monarch or dictator over his subjects, then what do you think might be the consequences of that upon the historical development of the human race, upon the social development of the human race? Surely I don't have to ask you to look at the whole of human history and even look around you today to see how that model, in fact, becomes embodied in human society. The myth becomes embodied in the political and social process. The second mythological framework is of God as the master and humans as the slave. I shudder to think that we can actually embrace a mythology which sees slave ownership, a master-slave relationship, as a model for the divine human relationship. Now, we might say that God is a good slave master, or we might have said that God is a benevolent dictator. But a dictator he still is, and a slave owner he still is. We are God's property. He owns us completely. Do I need to ask you to look at the history of the human race and look around at the world here to see how such a concept, a mythology of God as the master and humans as the slave, can affect human history and human development? That mythology becomes incarnate in human history and in human society. The third mythology is that of God as Father and we as his children. Now, we all might think that's a good relationship, father, children. What's wrong with that? But the problem is that this myth actually infantilizes the human race. We are permanently in a position of childhood, at best adolescence, vis-a-vis a God who must take care of us, who must protect us, who must tell us what to do, give us our moral guidance. This mythology of a father and children becomes built into society, and the human race is trapped in, at best, adolescence. When you look at the history of the human race and society around you, when you see people who are unable to make a moral decision without an authority telling them what to do, when you see people making bad decisions when they think no one's looking, isn't it clear how that mythology has in fact become embedded not only in society but in our individual lives, and it keeps us in a state of infancy, or perhaps worse, adolescence? The human race is maintained in a state of adolescence by the myth of the father and his children. Now, the death of God theology offers a new myth. It offers a myth wherein God takes on the human flesh, allows himself to die, exits from the world, and lets the human race develop. They're no longer the subject of a dictator. They're no longer slaves owned by a master, and they're no longer children who have to be looked after by a father. They are now free. They have freedom. Of course, risks come with that. Of course they do. But we want human beings to be free of earthly tyrants, don't we? We want slaves to be free of their masters, don't we? We want children to grow up into responsible adults, don't we? So when God takes himself out of the picture, he sets the human race and individuals to achieve these things. So that myth really quite strongly appealed to me. But the problem is that Christian theology, Christian mythology, doesn't stop there. The crucifixion is followed by the resurrection. So God doesn't really die, or if he does die, he's not dead for very long. He rises again after a couple of days. And what does he rise to? He rises to exactly the same thing. Now it's Jesus who is the King and the Lord. Now it is Jesus of whom we are slaves. Now it is Jesus who is our shepherd. We are now sheep. So those tyrannies now simply have the face of Jesus instead of just the face of God. So the resurrection completely undoes the good work that the crucifixion does by taking God out of the world. Now, I know that many of you have probably tuned out in horror by this point, and I know that the ecclesiastical and secular bodies that benefit from this oppressive Christian mythology are not going to surrender their power easily. But I hope you can understand why I didn't only leave the priesthood, I didn't only leave the church, I left the Christian mythology because I came to see that this Christian mythology is actually what is holding back the human race. And we can only move forward if, in fact, we kill off God or we kill off this myth of God. Now, I know that's going to be unpalatable for many, if not most of you, but that's the point that I finally arrived at. And believe it or not, it is actually another step towards liberation. Of course, I encourage you to leave comments below about this video. I dread to think of the kinds of things that you might want to say to me. But I won't be entering into any kinds of debates or extensive discussions. I really, if you disagree with me, I doubt that I will ever convince you otherwise and vice versa. But this is my story, this is my journey, and I've shared it with you as honestly as I can.